It all happened when I was young. I met a girl, fell deeply in love, and before I knew it, I had moved in with her and her parents. Life felt simple then, filled with hope and a sense of new beginnings. After 2 years together, we were blessed with a daughter. We had been waiting for that moment for what felt like forever, and when she finally arrived, she became the center of our world. My wife stayed home with her for a year and a half, dedicating herself entirely to our little family, while I worked tirelessly to provide. Eventually, she went back to work, and we placed our daughter in a daycare close to my wife's office. Things seemed fine, life was moving along, and I thought everything was as it should be. But looking back, I realized there were subtle signs, moments that I overlooked, thinking they were nothing more than the small waves of everyday life. The first alarm bell rang when I picked up our daughter from daycare one afternoon. It was a routine day, and as we were walking home, she asked me, in that innocent way children do, "Are we taking the car to go home today?" I stopped in my tracks. A car? We didn't have a car. Puzzled, I asked her what she meant, and she simply replied, "Mommy and I always drive home in a car." I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe she meant they got a ride from a colleague or a friend, something casual. But that small comment planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't quite shake off. I didn't ask my wife about it. The thought of hearing the truth, that there might be another man, terrified me. Instead, I let it simmer inside, gnawing at me in silence. After that day, I started to notice little things. She began coming home late more often, always with some excuse about work. At first, it was just a few hours here and there, but soon, it became a regular occurrence. Then came the nights when she stumbled through the door, clearly drunk, the smell of alcohol lingering in the air between us as she mumbled some incoherent explanation. In her conversations, a name began to crop up more frequently, Sergey, a colleague of hers. At first, it seemed like nothing, but soon, I noticed a pattern. She often spoke of him, but always with disdain, almost as if she were trying to convince herself, and me, that he meant nothing. She complained about how he had the audacity to comment on her appearance, specifically mocking her front teeth. I was dumbstruck by that. How could someone say something so hurtful, so personal? It shook me to hear her talk about it with such frustration, yet there was something in the way she mentioned him that felt off. Then there were the photos from the office parties. I'd look at them casually, not expecting anything unusual, but one face kept reappearing. A man, always nearby her, always in the background, but close enough to be noticed. He wasn't anyone I recognized, but over time, I couldn't help but feel like he was watching her, hovering in the edges of every picture like some shadow I couldn't quite make out. And then that day came, the day that shattered whatever fragile hope I had been clinging to. It was so ordinary at first, quiet, unremarkable. She had left for work in the morning, leaving behind the usual mess of clothes tossed carelessly around the bedroom. I wasn't looking for anything, just going through the routine of picking up after her when I found it. Her robe, draped over the chair. As I straightened it out, something fell out of the pocket. A small object, innocuous at first glance, but it sent a shock through me the moment I realized what it was, a pregnancy test. Time seemed to stop. My hands trembled as I stared at it, and my mind began to race. We hadn't been intimate in any real sense for months, and when we were always careful, always made sure nothing could come of it. And yet, here it was, a pregnancy test, right there in front of me, as undeniable as the truth it carried. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The suspicion that had been eating away at me for months, the late nights, the drunken arrivals, the colleagues she kept mentioning, it all came crashing down in that moment. I had been too scared to ask before, too terrified to face what I already knew deep down. But now, there was no avoiding it. I waited until she came home. I couldn't even look at her as I held up the test. My voice sounded foreign to me, hollow and distant. "Do I know him?" I asked, my words hanging in the air between us like a blade. Her response was swift, almost mechanical. "No, you don't know him." The world seemed to tilt around me, everything suddenly out of focus. So there it was, spoken out loud, the thing I had dreaded but never wanted to believe. It was real. She had been unfaithful, and now there was no denying it. The weight of it crushed me, even though part of me had known all along. But hearing it, having the truth laid bare before me, it was like being hit by a wave that pulled me under, drowning me in a sea of betrayal. I spiraled. The weight of everything that had happened, her betrayal, the cold admission that there was someone else, it broke me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I turned to the bottle. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. It just felt easier than facing the emptiness that had opened up between us. I left, wandered off for days, maybe weeks, losing myself in the numb haze of alcohol, trying to drown out the gnawing pain and confusion. But eventually, like some broken compass that always finds its way back to the same unsteady point, I returned. It was strange, coming back to her after everything. The tension was thick between us, unspoken but ever-present, hanging in the air like a fog we couldn't see through. I didn't ask for more details, didn't push her for explanations. What was the point? She agreed to go to the doctor with me, a trip to the gynecologist that felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. They told us she wasn't pregnant. Relief mixed with a strange emptiness filled me, but I went back to her, back to our shared life, like we could somehow patch up the gaping hole between us. But then, a week later, she was admitted to the hospital for reasons I never fully understood. It seemed sudden, out of nowhere, and I didn't question it. Perhaps I didn't want to. I buried my head in work, in routine, in anything that kept me from thinking too deeply about the mess my life had become. 9 months passed, and then, one day, there he was, our son. A long-awaited boy, someone I had silently yearned for. But the joy I should have felt, the overwhelming happiness of being a father to a son, was clouded by the shadows of everything that had come before. And then I found her medical file. It wasn't like I went looking for it, but there it was, almost as if it had been waiting for me to discover it. I skimmed through the pages, not really understanding the jargon until I saw it. An entry that didn't add up. The record of her pregnancies, one too many, unaccounted for. I stared at the page, the numbers blurring before my eyes. Another secret, buried beneath layers of lies. But I didn't confront her. What was the point? We had a son now, this beautiful, innocent child who hadn't asked for any of this. I had become too tired, too numb to stir the pot any further. Love for her had long since withered away, replaced by a weary sense of duty, by the habit of simply existing together. 9 years passed, and I drifted further from the man I once thought I'd be. I drank too much, smoked too often, and found comfort in fleeting affairs that filled the emptiness but never truly satisfied. My life had become a slow, self-destructive spiral, where I numbed myself to the reality of my crumbling marriage, barely clinging to the remnants of what used to be. The distance between us only grew wider as the years dragged on, and I no longer cared enough to bridge the gap. Then, I met her, a woman who'd been abandoned by her husband a year before. She lived in a different city, and from the moment we met, I fell hard. It wasn't just attraction. It was that all-consuming kind of infatuation that makes you forget everything else. Her presence was a spark in my otherwise gray existence, and I found myself making excuses to see her, until eventually, I was traveling to her city so often that I might as well have moved there. For 3 years, we lived in this strange limbo, half in one life, half in another. I'd practically left my wife behind, though we never officially parted ways. My heart was with this new woman, this hope of something better, something different. It was intoxicating, like starting over. I thought maybe this was my chance to be truly happy again, to erase the mistakes of the past and build something new. But life has a way of pulling you back down just when you think you've found an escape. The country fell into crisis, and with it, my business went under. The money dried up, and so did the dreams we had started to build together. In the end, when I asked her to marry me, to make something permanent out of the fleeting love we'd shared, she refused. It wasn't bitterness in her voice, just the harsh practicality of someone who had seen enough disappointment in life. She left for Moscow, seeking work, seeking stability, something I could no longer offer. And so, broken and defeated, I returned to the life I had once tried to leave behind. Back to my wife, to the same house, to the same routines that felt like a prison. I remember the moment vividly, as if it were yesterday. Sitting across from my mother-in-law in the dimly lit kitchen, the air between us thick with unspoken truths. It had been years, years of holding it all inside, pretending to live a normal life, raising children, and going through the motions of a marriage that had long since lost its meaning. And yet, here I was, teetering on the edge of a confession, knowing it was time to finally speak the words that had been festering within me for so long. "I know," I said, my voice low but steady. "I know that Natasha was pregnant with another man's child." Her reaction was far from the shock I had anticipated. There was no denial, no gasp of disbelief. Instead, she looked at me with a kind of weary acceptance, the kind of look someone gives when they've been carrying a secret for far too long. "I knew too," she said quietly, almost as if she were relieved to finally let it out. And just like that, the weight of all those years of suspicion, of quiet resentment, began to settle into something tangible. The truth wasn't a bombshell anymore. It was simply confirmation of what I had known all along. But knowing that her mother had been aware of the betrayal, had silently condoned it, somehow made the wound deeper. I couldn't keep it in any longer. The truth had to come out, not just to her mother, but to Natasha herself. I wasn't going to continue living in the shadows of lies, pretending that everything had been fine all these years. So, I waited for the right moment, when the house was quiet and it was just the two of us. I could feel the tension building in me as I approached her, my heart pounding with a mix of anger, sorrow, and desperation for closure. "I've known for a long time," I told her, my voice trembling just slightly. "I've known that you were pregnant, and it wasn't mine." Her reaction was far more defensive than I had anticipated. She didn't deny it outright, but she didn't admit to it either. Instead, she spun a web of half-truths, trying to protect herself from the full weight of her own actions. "I never loved you," she confessed, her eyes cold and distant. "I was always looking for something else, for love. But I was never unfaithful to you in the way you think." It was a lie, of course. I knew it. She knew it. We both knew it. But what stung the most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the indifference in her voice, the way she brushed aside my pain as though it were nothing more than an inconvenience. To her, it seemed, our life together had been nothing but a series of compromises, a partnership devoid of the love I had always believed, or at least hoped, would one day bloom between us. But what hurt even more was her refusal to fully admit what had happened. The pregnancy was undeniable, yet she still clung to her story, denying the truth even as it stared us both in the face. And her mother? Her mother didn't seem to care anymore. "I'm old," she said when I brought it up to her again, shrugging it off as if the past no longer had any significance. To her, life was about survival now, not the moral complexities of what had transpired between her daughter and me. So here I am, still living in the same house, still playing the role of the dutiful husband and father. I help them with everything: groceries, bills, the small things that keep a household running smoothly. From the outside, we might even appear like a normal family, functioning through the everyday motions of life. But inside me, nothing is normal. I remember everything. Every lie, every moment of betrayal, every bitter conversation that went unresolved. And perhaps the worst of it all was the timing. Just as I had been grappling with these revelations, my own love, my one true love, had left me. She was the woman who had filled the emptiness inside me, the woman who had shown me what love could truly be. And yet, even she had walked away when things got hard. She left me, just like Natasha had betrayed me, just like all the others seemed to vanish when life became difficult. That's what I've come to believe now. That's what life has taught me. Maybe all women are like this. They deceive you when you're not looking, and they leave you when the first sign of trouble appears. Maybe it's just the way things are, an inevitability I had foolishly tried to avoid. But now, finally, understand. I don't blame them anymore, not really. There's no point. I'm too tired for anger, too numb for outrage. What's left is a kind of weary resignation, the knowledge that life is not the fairy tale we're led to believe it is when we're young. People lie, they betray, and they leave. And all you can do is survive the storm, pick up the pieces, and move forward, if you can still muster the strength to. So, I stay. I stay because it's easier than leaving, easier than facing the emptiness of being alone once more. I stay because I've learned to live with the pain, to carry it with me like an old wound that never fully heals. I stay because, despite everything, this is the life I have now, and there's no point in fighting it anymore. But I'll never forget.